Well, let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Stephen Scoltetti. I'm a member of the faculty at the University of Mississippi, and I'm the director of the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. Debt, I think, is pretty clearly a bipartisan issue. For if there's one thing about which both the left and the right agree, it's that there are always more important things for us to worry about. Politicians from across both sides of the aisle seem to think that debt is an issue that can be put on the political back burner. But if you're like me, you probably have the sneaking suspicion that if debt ever stops being a back burner issue, it will be because the kitchen is already on fire. So for those of us who don't want to wait for conflagration, what should we be watching for? As citizens who might not have advanced degrees in economics, but who are trying our best to stay informed, what signs should we be watching to see whether our national debt, despite being ignored by politicians, is starting to affect our choices and is starting to affect our way of life and our liberty? To help us answer these sorts of questions, I've invited John H. Cochrane, the Rose Marie and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Professor Cochrane has written widely on finance, economics, and a number of other topics, has held many distinguished professorships, has served as an editor of key journals, and has won many different teaching and faculty awards at every point of his distinguished career. If there's anyone who can help us better understand the challenges we are facing today, it's Professor Cochrane. And I'm very grateful and humbled that he was willing to share his time with us today. Professor Cochrane, thank you so much for being here. And now I'll turn things over to you before we open things up for a conversation.
Thanks. It is a great pleasure to join you today. And I'm delighted not just to talk about my favorite topics, debt, inflation, and liberty, but also to unite those in a way. Usually I only get to talk about the economic aspects, but I think in fact these are important. So let me just make a few comments off the top. Here is our debt situation. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. Debt relative to GDP. You can see World War I, almost no debt. World War I, Great Depression, World War II, slowly paid most of that off. In fact, we did pay most of it off, inflated some of it away, but paid most of it off. The 80s, again, a pattern of getting in debt and paying it back. But then starting in 2008, the Great Recession of 2008, the huge amounts of the pandemic. This graph was made actually before it was as much as it is. And then what is to come. And this is the CBO's projections. These are not a forecast. But this is the CBO's idea of, given current law and assuming a relatively placid economic situation, what will happen to the debt. And you can notice that looks like a ski jump in reverse. That's bad news. I drew in a slightly even more pessimistic forecast because, of course, the CPO is assuming that nothing bad ever happens again, that we just go on, we trundle along with something I consider bad: too slow, sclerotic economic growth, unrestrained deficits, social programs, European social programs, and American taxes. But the CBO forecasts here looked, just like the steady upward sloping. They didn't have Great Recession and pandemic. In fact, our fiscal situation is about $1 trillion a year of deficits in good times. And then every decade, we have a once in 100 years crisis. And we rack up another, the most recent was $5 trillion of debt, 30% of GDP, 30% of the outstanding. So I figure bad stuff's going to happen. In fact, bad stuff already did happen. We forget about wars and pandemics and things like that. Bad stuff's going to happen. So here's, an even more pessimistic view of where things will go. Of course, the Congressional Budget Office says explicitly This is what will happen if you guys don't do something to fix it. But if you guys don't do anything to fix it, that's where we're going. And in fact, it's conservative because it includes many of Congress's promises to do things that it never gets around to doing. Now, one way of looking at it is debt. Here is deficits. How much are we, is the government spending more than it takes in every year? And there you go. It's in percentage of GDP. So to give you round numbers, GDP is about 20 trillion. $1 trillion is about 5% of GDP. And so here's what happened in the great, in crises, it is appropriate. Crises, war, it is appropriate for the government to borrow money, spend a lot, hopefully a little more wisely next time than we've done it the last two times, but spend a lot. World War II, we borrowed a lot of money, spent a lot, saved the world, and then paid it off. And that you can sort of see that pattern happening, although unusually did not pay it off. We really never got to primary surpluses. Historically, we always got to primary surpluses. And then, of course, the pandemic, and here are projections of where we're going in the future. Now, what's happening in the future here is two important things. The first is Medicare, Social Security, those kinds of commitments. And second, interest costs on the debt. The higher the debt, the higher the interest that you pay on the debt. And you can see the deficits are just unending. This too is very conservative. Our government has made all sorts of off-the-books promises. So for example, right now we're debating, are we going to just forgive all the student loans? Bing, there's another $100 billion under the net. All home mortgages are effectively insured by the federal government. Well, there's some other things that could show up. So things are, if anything, worse than this looks. So that's the situation we face. We have borrowed a tremendous amount of money and we got no plan for paying it off. Now, I should, one of the most common, I won't give you 10 objections, but one of the objections coming out of Washington is, well, don't worry about it. The interest costs are low. Secretary Yellen said that. We can afford lots of debt because we don't pay much interest on it. Now, that is sort of the attitude of the household who says, don't worry, honey, we can buy the TV on the credit card because we can afford the payments. Not a good long-run financial planning. And there's a lot to say about that. I have papers on all these topics if you're curious. But let's this is a quantitative question. And so the most point. So here is for the economists in the room, I put the equation, and for the philosophers in the room, here's the fact. The rate of growth of debt to GDP, this growth rate here, equals the interest rate minus the growth rate of GDP. So as you pay interest on the debt, the debt accumulates. If you borrow more money to pay the interest on the old money, the debt accumulates. But debt relative to GDP is really what matters. That's the government's taxing power. So if the GDP grows faster than the interest rate on the debt, you're actually in great shape. That's a negative number and debt will go away on its own. You can grow out of debt rather than pay it off. Minus, of course, surpluses. If the government takes in more than it pays out, then that also pays down debt. So there's two ways of paying down debt. One, low interest rates relative to growth, and the other, surpluses. So the big line these days is don't worry about it. The interest rate is low. It's lower than the growth rate on debt. These things will melt all on their own. The problem with this point of view is not theoretical. It is quantitative. By how much is the interest rate over the next 50 years, not just now, how much are interest rates going to be lower than the growth rate of the economy for the next 50 years? Well, for the next 50 years, while we attempt to simply grow out of debt rather than pay it off. Well, I'll give you 1%. It could be that the growth rate of the economy is now about 2%. The long-run interest rate's 1%. If we're really, really, really lucky and long-run interest rates stay at 1%, you can get 1% out of this. In other words, you could fund a 1% of GDP deficit forever just by having interest rates be low and rolling it over. Isn't that lovely? There's sort of a free lunch. Well, sort of. Remember 1% of GDP. Here's our deficits. Always look at the vertical scale. Another one for you philosophers. Sorry, I got to make fun of philosophers today. The vertical scale is -5. Our problem is not a 1% of GDP problem. Our problem is a 5% of GDP problem. And in fact, this is hauled out as an excuse for, we can afford to borrow a lot and then just grow out of it. If that were the case, we would already have debt declining. We already have debt rising. So the argument of low interest costs is a great one for economists to debate. It involves limits to infinity of all sorts of things, but the potential is a 1% of GDP manna from heaven. We got a 5% of GDP problem, so that's not going to cure it. Now, what about inflation? So I am the book I'm promoting these days is called The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, and fundamentally, inflation comes from problems of government debt, from governments that cannot pay extended deficits and turn to printing money to pay off their deficits. And it's really all debt that counts, because government debt just promises to give you more money. So where are we? Well, we are at here is the price level, the consumer price index. The core eliminates food and energy. CPI has everything in it. And steady inflation of about 2% is this line rising at about 2% a year. That's where we were until the pandemic hit. There was a little bit of prices going down. Prices recovered fully to where they had been, and then started trundling up at the usual 2% until January of 2021. And bing, you can see here the rise in inflation. You can see this is not just the catch up of the decline in prices during the recession happened. This is genuine inflation coming seemingly out of nowhere. Well, why? Where did this come from? There's a lot of debate about that, but it looks to me perfectly obvious. If you have your fiscal hat on, here is what happened, a bigger view in the pandemic. Here's the debt. This is the same number as I showed you on the blue graph, purple, just expanded. So there's debt rising in trillions of dollars. It was only 5 trillion back in 2007, rising and rising and rising. 17 trillion on the eve of the pandemic. Boom, about 25 trillion now. So that's almost 30% rise in the value of debt. What happened? In the pandemic, our government literally printed up $3 trillion of new money and sent people checks. It borrowed another $2 trillion of money and sent people checks. Now, that's not entirely a bad thing to do. During a crisis, during a pandemic, you certainly need to give some insurance. You want to keep businesses from failing. People who've lost their jobs need help. But we went way, way beyond that. We sent checks to, I would like to joke and say every registered voter, except in fact, we sent checks to a whole lot of people who weren't registered voters too. In the two, and businesses and paid people's rents and so on and so forth. So this is huge. We call this a helicopter drop in economics. You want to know where inflation comes from, and you think a little bit about fiscal theory versus inflation. That is the obvious culprit in an economy that didn't really need it. There wasn't really lack of demand. It was closed down because of a pandemic. And the minute it opened up again, things went back pretty much to normal. So I think we are beginning to see, we're right at a crossroads now. I've been like, the old guy with the sign saying the world's about to end for quite a while now, and I've been wrong. I was saying that around here. But the emergence of inflation does tell us that we're on the cusp. Inflation comes when people stop having faith that the government can pay back its debts, and at least this amount of money, people have stopped having faith that debt is just something. Don't worry about it. The government's going to pay it back. Will that continue? I don't know. I hate forecasting hard, especially about the future. But we have crossed a Rubicon of sorts. And if people start to doubt, people evidently doubt that this extra debt is going to get paid off. When people start to doubt that debt, then we're in real trouble. So that is, in fact, the scenario that I put it here, the danger. What is the danger? The danger of debt is usually posed as, our children and our grandchildren will have to pay this off. Interest rates might rise. That always, as Stephen said, that always seems like I'll worry about it in the next administration or the one after that. Let Malia Obama worry about paying back the debt, or I'm sorry, I need to be bipartisan here. What's Trump's grandchildren's name? Or Jenna Bush can worry about it. But that is not, I think, the danger. It's like sea level rise. That danger, something that comes very slowly, and you have time to take care of it. That is not the danger. The danger is what we may be seeing the signs of here, of a global sovereign debt crisis. Where do financial crises come from? They come from people are worried about a bunch of debt that can't be paid off. Check. There's accounting that's really shady. Check. The debt is very short term. It's being rolled over all the time. Check. And suddenly we lose confidence in that. So, if you want a nightmare, if you want to stay up at 2 a.m, imagine the war gets worse. China invades Taiwan. China dumps all its treasuries. Why they still have treasuries is beyond me, because we've just proven that we can shut them off anytime we want. Italy tries to dump its treasuries. Europe goes into a debt crisis. All those student loans come due. And people say, you know what, even the US government, I'd rather have gold or Bitcoin or stocks or real estate or anything. And then inflation breaks out suddenly. It's a debt crisis kind of phenomenon. Welcome to Argentina. Welcome to France and the revolution. We've seen many debt crises before. Sovereign debt, the idea that sovereign debt is safe is a very recent idea. We have 800 years of sovereign debt being, and that's, I think, the nature of the crisis to worry about. Now, debt, Stephen started with, what's the worst thing in the world? Debt is actually not the worst thing in the world. And how do you solve this problem? This is growth in GDP. I used potential GDP to make it smoother. In the post-war period, the US grew at 4% and then 3%. Now we're growing at 2%. Let's say 4, 3, 2, who cares? But the most amazing thing about our economy is how much better we are than our grandparents. And not just in terms of, we don't have 4 Model Ts in the front yard and they had 1. Everything's better. Our health is better. Our air is better. Our lifespans are better. Global poverty is plummeting. It's in some sense a wonderful world. All of that coming out of GDP growth, and that's cut in half. So that's kind of a tragedy of there's an end of empire feeling about us in many ways, which you'll recognize. And in economic terms, the slowdown in growth is the tragedy. And that's really the solution. How do you square this debt circle? If you want to solve the debt problem, what do? Well, you cannot raise enough taxes to do this without killing the economy. Marginal tax rates are already quite high. If you simply try raising taxes to pay off debt is like it's at least climbing up a sand dune, where every step forward you take by raising the tax rates, the economy dies a little bit and you slip back down again. So that's not going to work. And there comes a moment where budget shenanigans don't work. The key is growth. Tax revenue is tax rate times income. Raising the tax rate isn't that useful, but raising the income is. So a serious pro-freedom, pro-growth agenda kicks that back up to 4%, and we would pay off this debt in no time. Which leads me to my last set of thoughts. What about liberty? If we do get to a global sovereign debt crisis, it's going to be terrible. They're going to grab all your money that they can. That's just a fact. But I think there is right now a related and separate worry for liberty. I hope here I can a little bit come out of the closet as a libertarian with many adjectives attached to it, like practical, empirical, constitutional, rule of law, so forth. But from that point of view, really, the greatest threats are right now in the area of financial regulation. Our banking system is an oligopolized beast that is more and more doing the will of its political masters. One way you see this is in the climate financial regulation. And I don't care how you feel about climate. I think climate's a problem. But having the Federal Reserve tell companies what they must do, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, that they must pursue a particular climate policy, namely strangle all fossil fuels before alternatives are available. That's a highly political thing, and you can see financial regulation being used to advance political goals. Now that's a little bit worrisome, more worrisome, as they have shown. Well, the Canadian truckers are a good example. Here are people on a political protest exercising their right to assemble peaceably for the redress of grievances, and they had their bank accounts seized. I put down just one epigraph. The freedom to transact, to buy and sell, to save, to invest anonymously and free from government interference, that is crucial to your economic and political liberty. We've taken little steps. They debanked the pot farmers. They tried to kick the for-profit colleges out of the financial system. We've seen sanctions being used internationally more and more. And as we get towards, we're moving towards digital currency. And I think this is where it really hits. Do you want to live in a society where the government can see every single transaction you make? That's the way it is now in China. So China's new digital currency, the Central Bank of China can watch every transaction you make. And if it doesn't like your social credit score and it doesn't like what you're buying, it can shut you off. Well, that's the danger of, now it's applied sanctions to oligarchs and to countries we don't like. But as we move to electronic transactions, that is, I think, the great danger. I mean, imagine the loss of political freedom if you go out and protest and the FBI gets your name and shuts down your bank account, your ability to earn a living, your ability to buy anything, or even just monitors everything you bought. Try running for office and every transaction you've ever made is one leak away. So that we used to have cash, which was anonymous and a great safety valve against oppression. That's going away. It's already gone away. You're limited in the amount of cash that you can use. Now, some people may say, "Oh, crypto is the answer," but that's a dark, dark idea that we would live in a surveillance state and can have an illegal out by using crypto. It's a very inefficient economy. Legal anonymity, the right to transact privately, is important. And of course, it's a difficult problem because if you can do everything anonymously, the government will never collect another set of taxes. So I leave you with that tension for today's society. I think that is one of the biggest dangers to freedom. And when you think about the Federal Reserve, think more about financial regulation and less about where interest rates are. Okay, I'll stop there and open it up for questions, comments, reactions, speeches, and so forth.
Well, great. Thanks so much. If you have a question, you can go ahead and in the chat, just type the word question, and then I can call on you. Or if you don't feel comfortable with that, you could also type your question into the chat, and I can read it for you. Either way.
I'm also comfortable with just yell your question.
Or you can just, okay. Or we can just yell your question.
I come from the University of Chicago, and if somebody doesn't, tell you you're a moron every 5 minutes,
And then,
trying to figure out how to get rid of my screen share and having difficulty doing it.
Yeah, well, actually, it's okay. I turned it off on this end.
Oh, okay, so, no way.
Yeah.
How do I end this thing?
Right, yeah. So you're good. Well, how about, actually, does anyone want to jump out right at first, or I can start asking my own questions as the philosopher who got made fun of several times during the talk? Go ahead, I'll open it up.
I'm happy to jump in. Christian Salar, I teach in the Department of Public Policy Leadership. I am a geographer by training. You seem to suggest that freedom of transaction is going to be enough to restore post-World War II growth rate and therefore be able to solve the debt problem over time. Did I understand your argument?
No.
No. Okay.
And thanks, I was going too fast. Yeah. I think freedom of transaction is a core element of economic and political freedom that is now under threat. I don't think that is the reason for the decline in growth and the central problem of our growth. The central problem of our growth is that we've moved from a rights society to a permission society. Try to rehab your house in Palo Alto. It takes 10 years to get the permits, and then they tell you what you can do. Let's be liberal about this. Try to build a windmill and build a transmission line to get to the windmill. 10 years later, you're still going to be in court fighting on, the NIMBYs are going to tell you can't do it. I think the regulatory state is primarily the reason why growth has gone down. Just the web of laws, regulations, barriers to entry. That's at least a big part about it. The end of growth is, I'll admit, an economically contentious question, but it certainly can't help. Talk to any entrepreneur who started a business, 10 or 20 years ago, and the ones I talk to say, well, I'd never start that today, because how would I get $100 million HR and compliance department going? I couldn't have afforded to do that. So I think of the freedom of financial freedom as one of the big problems we're going to face going forward that is going to cause even worse problems, but not the central causes of our growth slowdown.
But I still don't understand the connection between what you started with, which is the problem of soaring debt, and
There is
yeah. So there is no solution to the initial.
Oh no, there's a solution to the debt problem. It's not debt problem and your freedom of transaction are related. The solution to the debt problem is, I think, return to growth. Well, first, stop spending like a drunken sailor, okay? So we need to reform spending to spend on things that are useful, not on things that are complete waste. And I've taken some time with the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better bill. It's just it's a mess of completely wasted money. So I'm not saying throw grandma off the back of the train, but we certainly can achieve the goals of spending much more efficiently. Reform the tax system so that it is raising revenue at minimal distortion of the economy and not trying to do 100 other things. I don't want to call it deregulation, but fix the regulations so that they actually work program, I think, is the answer to that, which is sort of general reforms that every sclerotic society has either undertaken or else fallen to pieces.
Stop here.
And that's where you pay off your debt. You pay off your debt when you start growing like crazy, and then the tax revenue starts flowing in.
So there is space here for a rollback of the state.
Well, I hope so. Or let's call it a reform of the state. There's this language, people talk about regulation, like we need more or less regulation. You just pour it in or pour it out. No, you need stuff that is smart, that is cost benefit tested, that is not full of unintended consequences, that isn't just protecting individuals and industries against competition, that is, actually functional. And I think we need a smarter state more than more or less state. I'm not an anarchist libertarian. I'm a good government, rule of law, competent. We need a good government.
John, actually, just a quick question I often think about, and again, as a philosopher and not an economist, but I do pay attention to this number that sometimes talk about the ratio of debt to GDP. I know now it's like at 130, I think, percent, something like that. And I often wonder, is there a percentage that you look for, which, if it hit that number, that it's time to start buying gold, or that the end is near. If it hits like 150%, we've reached the ruinous stage. Or is that just an artificial? I'm sure that's too simplistic, but is there any sort of point at which you personally would say, yeah, there's the number? What we really are at the end. We can't sustain this any longer.
Not really. So
okay.
Less is better.
Yeah.
And there is, I think Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff in their famous book sort of proclaim 90% as a danger point, but that's holding a lot of other things constant that aren't held constant in life. So government finance is no particularly different than personal finance. Governments can borrow a tremendous amount of money and pay it off if they have a reason for borrowing it and they have a plan to pay it off. So at the end of World War II, we were in the well over 100% of debt to GDP. Well, we borrowed it for a darn good reason. But as of 1945, the war was over and everybody understood. In fact, people thought the war was a lot more over than it really was. So we're going to stop spending money. The reason for spending money was over. And everybody understood, as we did, that the government would go back to its habit of running steady, small primary surpluses for taking in more than it spent in reasonably good times. So there was a plan for paying off the debt. There was by today's standards, much less regulated, very innovative economy that was going to grow like crazy and provide a lot of revenue for the government, even at current tax rates. So, like a young household, a young assistant professor at, no, well, let's say a young, just tenured professor at your university who walks into a bank and says, I'd like to buy 100%, borrow 100% of my income to buy a house, or 200% of my income to borrow. So, they say, yeah, great. 200% of your income to borrow for a house, no problem. Because why? There's a reason. We know that you're not going to be doing this every year because you're funding a house. You're not going to Las Vegas. There's a plan to pay it off. But if you say I'm going in and I've been in debt my whole life and I just went bankrupt 3 times and I have this trip to Las Vegas that I want to fund, well, then it's a lot harder to borrow it and pay it off. So that's, where I worry is not so much the quantity of debt, but the debt relative to a plan to pay it off.
All right, we've got a question from the chat here. Could you please talk more about crypto being dark? And were you comparing it to China's digital transaction economy?
Yeah, crypto is always fun to talk about. There's 2 kinds of crypto I think we need to distinguish. One is the original Bitcoin, which is simply it's pieces of nothing. Excuse me. It's a reinvention of paper money, and the other is backed or stable coins, which are a reinvention of the money market mutual fund or the reinvention of the 19th century bank. There's really nothing new financial here, but there's a new technology for doing it. Now, what are the parts of crypto you're attracted to? Do you care about central ledgers versus decentral ledgers and computational efficiency? Maybe not. I think so when we talk about crypto, let's be sure we know what we're talking about. My comments were in the anonymity. So Bitcoin had this advantage of it's anonymous, which is why hackers, and it's a great way to do bad things like ransom your computer. It's also a great way to do good things like get around China's currency controls, Venezuela's currency controls, get money out of Russia and into Ukraine, which, all things which are technically illegal, but some of which we cheer and some of which we don't. The problem with crypto as a way to avoid government surveillance is, for the moment, you still need to get money in and out of crypto so that they can regulate it. And the NSA can see who's using the crypto also. For it to be really sort of the libertarian paradise the government can't see, you would need to be able to sell your services for crypto, and then you'd need to be able to go to the grocery store and buy stuff with crypto. And all against a government who hates this and is trying to put you in jail for doing it. That's just not a way to run a sensible society. So crypto that's the sense, crypto, it does look like it's anonymous, and it for the moment mostly is, but our governments are very capable of regulating the on and off ramps to crypto or shutting it all down if they want to. So I don't think it's the particular magic bullet answer to what we're looking for.
Yeah. Another question from the chat. For those of us that will be retiring in 10 years or so, do you think our federal and state pensions are in jeopardy?
Yes.
Okay. Right.
So let's talk about what could happen. Probably nominal no, but in inflation adjusted terms, yes, or maybe even, so when countries get to a debt crisis, they cut pensions, or they have a huge inflation and they don't raise the pensions to match the inflation. States now, I don't know, how's your state government doing? Ours is
better than California's.
Better than California's. Well,
yeah.
We're all doing great right now, thanks to a big infusion from the federal government. And my bet is that when I was in Chicago, Illinois seemed to be the next one to go. But I actually thought they would go bankrupt while Obama was still in office, because there's no way he wouldn't bail them out.
Right.
One of our problems, financial problems, is we are on the bailout bandwagon, and we just did it again. Everything that the Fed promised it would never do again in 2008, it just did again, and nobody seems to care. We bailed out the treasury market. We bailed out money market mutual funds. We bailed out state and local governments. We bailed out the corporate bond market. The Fed said corporate bond prices shall never go below X. So do you really believe that if the state of Mississippi goes under, that the federal government would not bail out the states and your pensions? And your pensions may be ERISA protected too, or at least you get something out of them. So you may get back money, but it may be funny money.
Yeah. Here's another question from the chat. Should we return to a gold standard? Would that be an effective solution to debt and inflation, in your opinion?
No.
Yeah.
These are my attempts to give short answers for which I'm not.
That's great. No, thank you.
But now I'll give you the long answer.
Yeah, that's okay. That's a hard question.
The gold standard has the main point of a gold standard, I view it, it's a commitment to sober fiscal policy. Because if you stand there and say, every dollar, a real gold standard, every dollar you have, you can go to the treasury and say, give me 1/32 of an ounce of gold. And that keeps the value of the dollar stable. And it did over centuries. The price level was quite stable. And what is that really doing? What it's really doing is the government has to have the gold. And how does the government get the gold? Well, it has to raise taxes or it has to be able to borrow against future taxes in order to give you the gold. So it's a pre-commitment not to run deficits that you can't repay. And that's kind of a lovely feature until, of course, all of a sudden you can't repay them. And then you abrogate the gold standard, go off as they did, suspend convertibility and have a crisis. So it's an attempt at a pre-commitment, but then like all pre-commitments, it leads to crises. And the gold standard was full of crises when governments couldn't make that. The price level is always about the government's ability to pay its debts. And under a gold standard, if it tries, it's tying yourself to Odysseus's mast. Yes, we will always pay our debts until all of a sudden we can't, and then boom, there's a thing. Also, under the gold standard, there was indeed a lot of inflation and deflation. The price level was stable over long periods of time. It's always jumping up and down because the gold might get discovered, or the relative price of gold. What you care about is the price of everything else. Now, if you look at gold now, gold varies in value relative to everything else. So one view of the gold standard is, well, we'll hold the tail of the dog steady. The problem is if you do that, the dog wags. It doesn't just slow the whole thing down. And today, even, I think the linkages, your hope is that if you keep the price of gold steady, the price of everything else will stay steady too. But the link between the value of the gold and value of everything else is pretty weak today. So I think even if our government nailed the dollar in terms of gold, well, so, suppose you nailed the dollar in terms of gold, $1,000 an ounce. What actually stops inflation? What stops the price of everything else from going up and down? Well, the links between, you're going to go buy gold bars and you're going to buy TVs and gold bars instead of TVs? Not that much. So I don't think it's an effective way to run a modern economy. We're going to try a medium answer next time.
Right. Another question I have, and I know this just requires you to kind of speculate somewhat, but I have a hard time understanding why more politicians aren't more concerned about this. And I know one answer is look, politicians are self-interested. They're not, they're only engaged in short-term thinking. And I understand those kind of explanations, but given the kind of problems that we're talking about here and the kind of calamity that we're imagining, I mean, there's got to be people who are well-intentioned, but who just, I guess, fundamentally aren't worried for principled reasons, I think. And I'm just, in your opinion, what are the principled reasons that politicians don't seem to take the level of debt seriously?
I've talked to lots of politicians who absolutely get this.
Yeah, okay.
Get it maybe a little too much. The debt is a long-term problem and it needs structural reform. And we've had structural reforms in the US in the past. We had a Social Security reform. You can put together a bipartisan commission on how to reduce the deficit and the debt and come up with sensible answers in about 10 minutes. People care. There is so I'll channel Janet Yellen, our Secretary Treasurer, who said, don't worry about the debt because interest costs are low. And I think that's there's very famous people on that bandwagon. I think it's wrong and short-sighted, but it's not ill-intentioned. And I think, it is a long-term problem that You may feel that other things are more pressing today. The real problem is getting voter traction with it. So lots of politicians, in fact, more than you would expect, say we got to do something about the debt because it's this looming problem. And they're not able to make it salient to voters quite why it is such a looming problem. But it is one of those things. So the debt, it's like climate change. If you make it a partisan issue, then you're not going to get anywhere because you're going to do something about it for 4 years and then it's going to all get done the next 4 years. So it does require one of those sober moments of turn off the TV cameras, turn off the Twitter, let's sit down and do the sort of sensible things we all know need to be done sooner or later. And also, sometimes it takes a crisis to, isn't that supposed to be a terrible thing to waste? So sometimes societies get to a point of crisis and then they reform. But you got to have hope in democracy that once and inflation might be. So the good side of inflation, this is grabbing people's attention. And I think the combination of the inflation and the war in Ukraine has already really stirred up policies. So Europe has looked at its energy policies and say, this was a horrible mistake, and we are going. They're getting there. I read, Belgium had 5 nuclear plants. They decided they were going to close them all down. They said, well, we'll keep 2 going. Well, 2's progress. But Germany has certainly figured out that we went down a path and just a very sudden reawakening. So inflation is really where this sort of dream of all we need to do to solve any problem is the government to throw money at it. That's where it goes to die. And I think people are, even as I read on the left, that they are recognizing there is a supply side of the economy and it's limited and it needs our attention. The problems of America are not just solved by printing or borrowing more money and throwing it at it. So that's healthy. And I read the New York Times on weekends, the Wall Street Journal on weekdays, but New York Times on weekends, wait a minute, it's impossible to build a transmission line to get solar panels energy to cities. We got to fix the zoning and permitting and environmental quality act so we can do this. Yeah, we do. Welcome to supply land. So that's my attempt to be hopeful.
Yeah. All right, another question from the chat here. It seems that a reduction in defense spending normally is near the top of the list during reduction talks. In your opinion, how important is it to keep a robust defense spending plan?
Well, so I'm torn as a good libertarian on these issues.
Right.
So let's just start with facts. U.S. defense spending is at historic low. We're spending something like 3% of GDP, $788 billion. That's a lot of money, but it's historically, compared to what we were spending during the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, we are spending relatively little. I think it's about 3% of GDP. The federal government as a whole, the government as a whole is about 45% of GDP spending right now. In France, this is 55. We're not far behind France. You count, in fact, not just what we spend on the books. America has this great habit of hiding things off the books. So rather than tax and give people health care, we say, you pay for his health care. Well, that's really a tax and spend too. So we're, really our spending in terms of economic impact is close to half the economy. 3% of that is defense. So there's just not a lot of money to be gotten out of defense compared to, the welfare state is everything as far as government spending is concerned. Now, government, defense contracting is a notorious sinkhole of all sorts of, lots of things get wasted. Our defense spending is, in fact, now, I talked to H.R. McMaster, one of our generals, about it, and starting with defense, and he pointed out a lot of our defense spending is on pensions and healthcare for veterans, not so much on new tanks and guns. So I'm certainly all for reforming defense spending. And we live in a dangerous world. So it would be, if China invades Taiwan, which is more of a when rather than an if you don't think, if you think there should be at least some deterrent or capability to say something about that, you would rather we had stuff that worked and also a good plan to use it, which seems to be the other half of the problem. It's awfully nice, as we face Russia, the underlying fact is Russia spends $62 billion a year on defense. We spend 788. So if we chose to fight about it, well, it's nice that we have a lot of extra stuff. So those are the conundrums of defense spending. But the bottom line is, defense spending is not a budget issue for the United States right now. It's about entitlements.
Does anyone else? I don't want to jump in again.
We've got another chat. Who was it? Steve Young.
Yeah. Oh, I skipped over that. Yeah. How much do you think our drunken spending is part of the problem with debt? I've heard many times that the U.S. doesn't have a debt problem, but a spending problem.
Exactly.
Right.
We have a spending, and we have a spending problem now. We have a spending problem of promises being made to people that we won't keep. One of the, I know how the state of Illinois got into trouble. They didn't have the money to pay government salaries to unionized employees now. So they said, here, we'll promise you endless pensions and healthcare. And then 20 years went by and that all came due. Debt is really about spending now more. Taxes have to equal spending sooner or later, and debt just means that you're doing the spending now and hoping the taxes will come later, or the reduction of spending will come later. So it all drives from the spending, and the bulk of it is, despite all the government wastes immense amounts of money, but the government has always wasted immense amounts of money. Where it's really all going is in mailing people checks, which is sometimes a great thing to do and sometimes a very wasteful thing to do.
Another question I have is, do you think of the United States right now as being in just in completely uncharted territory? Like we're just in this sort of new period that has no precedent? Or do you find yourself looking back to any previous point in American history where you can kind of find lessons, or even other countries? Obviously, we hear, or at least I hear about, these catastrophic situations where there's hyperinflation in different countries in the past, but we're not there yet, at least. So I wonder, are there more helpful historical parallels that you find yourself thinking about and looking to?
Well, we could go there.
Yeah, well, no, that's right.
It is. So there's a feeling among Americans this could never happen here, and that applies to civil disintegration, that applies to the government falling apart, that applies to hyperinflation, that applies to government debt. Now, the laws of economics are the same for us as they are for any other country. So whatever happens somewhere else could happen here, and unless we take care that it doesn't. I do look to historical precedents, and there's a robust menu out there before saying that, that what we see is completely not on the menu. The menu of the 1970s is, I think, salient. And it's funny, as I noticed, my fellow economists, that they divide into people my age who have some memory of what happened, or even just historical knowledge. It's surprising how many young people don't. The analogies to the 1970s are kind of strong. The break. So, what do you got? Inflation's breaking out, a debt problem caused from too much spending. Then it was Vietnam War and Great Society. Now it's other things. A Federal Reserve who has announced its monetary policy is essentially exactly what we all learned in graduate school the Fed did during the 1970s, which caused inflation. So you got that ingredient. And in fact, a lot of the rhetoric, the left-right rhetoric, 1968 was the big year for America, and things have been playing out very similar. They hated Nixon every bit as much as they hated Trump, and similarly on the right hated who do you want, McCarthy, every bit as much as they hate Biden. So polarization's not new. Oil prices, stagnating output, civil unrest, cities burning. The 70s are certainly, nothing ever repeats perfectly, but that's certainly a event. And I think we do well to learn. Americans tend to be very focused in time and in space. The Latin America is full of monetary and fiscal events gone badly. There's a wonderful new book out from University of Minnesota Press that my colleagues put together on Latin American inflations and their lessons. lots of that. The same mechanisms could happen here. And I also look back to, I'll recommend Tom Sargent and George Hall, are great economists who write with very few equations and sparkling prose. You would all love it. But they cover the history of debt and deficits in early America. So, Alexander Hamilton, who famously paid off the Revolutionary War debt. But they don't tell you, Alexander Hamilton also let the continental greenbacks inflate away. We've had a hyperinflation. The greenbacks inflated, the continentals inflated to nothing. The greenbacks inflated a great deal, but then we chose to pay back the greenbacks at par. So, in fact, I think we are, we are not that exceptional relative to many periods in history. And many periods in history, I look at it and we also assume, everything is always going to come out right because it always did in the past. We came darn close to disaster so many times in the past. So that I guess I'm old and I worry.
Well, unless there are any other questions, that has been an hour. Professor Cochrane, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. For an hour, we packed so much information in there. It was really informative. And thank you all for attending. And thanks once again. Let's give a virtual round of applause and thank you to Professor Cochrane.
And I'll plug, if this is interesting, if you Google me, you'll find my website where there's all sorts of stuff, including the new book, Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, which you can still get free until Princeton makes it. You take it off the website. You'll find my blog, The Grumpy Economist, which is mostly written with no equations whatsoever, where I talk about current issues and many other things. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, take care, everyone.